So everyone, well, I'm assuming, but most of us know that counting the Omer is something that we do that connects Pesach to Shavuot, right? And that's pretty much what I knew most of my life and didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it over the years. And more recently, I've kind of taken a deeper dive into it, and I feel like it's such a beautiful Kabbalistic expression of the cycles, spiritual cycles that we have, and an opportunity for a real mindfulness practice. Um, so it's more than just saying, okay, we're waiting on Shavuot. It's that too. But we start, of course, with Pesach and this experience of freedom from Mitzrayim and this narrow thinking. And then we're commanded, after all these commands, we're sort of admonished to, hey, begin this counting now. And it what Jack touched upon last week has a lot to do with it, which is that we have this symbiotic relationship with nature, right? And the cycles of nature. And many of our holidays and many of the prescriptions in the Torah relate to us experiencing those cycles of nature on the level of Chachma and Bina, both the experience of it and an understanding of it. So it's wisdom and understanding that we kind of combine together. The holiday itself, I'll read there's a couple of Torah portions the Torah sections that relate to it. I'm going to go from Leviticus 23:9, uh, probably through 12, and just read it to you. God spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to the Israelite people and say to them, when you enter the land that I am giving to you and you reap its harvest, you shall bring the first sheaf." Sheaf is Omer, right? And throughout the years, it's become to be related to a sheaf of barley. Okay? So when you enter the land that I am giving to you and you reap its harvest, you shall bring the first sheaf, Omer, of your harvest to the priest. He shall elevate the sheaf before God for acceptance in your behalf. The priest will elevate it on the day after the Sabbath. Part of the confusion. You must count until the day after the seventh week, 50 days. Then you shall bring an offering of new grain to Yud-Heh-Vav-Heh. You shall bring your settlements 2 loaves of bread as an elevation offering. Each shall be made of the 2/10 of a measure of choice flour baked after leavening as first fruits to God. So the question became, for a long time, it was hotly debated. It's not so hotly debated anymore. As David said, the Pharisees sort of won this argument. So the Hebrew people have always been very sectarian, and they are till this day, right? So this should be no surprise. But the Pharisees at the time contended that the Sabbath referred to in the Torah was the Sabbath of Pesach, right? That day of rest. So after that day of rest of Pesach began the counting of the Omer. And that counting lasted 49 days, 7 times 7. That brings us to Shavuot, which is the festival of weeks, right? So we have this connection, and the Torah is clearly connecting them. But this is not totally clear as to the beginning of the counting, which changes things, right? So the Sadducees and the Essenes believe that it was the Sabbath, actual Sabbath, the seventh day, that began the counting. And others believed it was the day after the 7 days commanded of Pesach, which is also a day of rest. So we have these Yom Tovs, and we have the Sabbaths, and we have these things that we're commanded to do. And we get a little OCD with them, I think. As a people, we tend to be very intellectual and we tend to want to know what is the right way to do things. And that's a good thing, right? But we have, in my experience, in my family and in my teaching of students and in myself, I feel that there's always this battle of, this sort of unbounded Hitlerut enthusiasm for doing God's will and practicing in a way that will lead us to a higher enlightenment, right? And there's that. And then there's also this struggle of trying to be within boundaries and doing things the way they're supposed to be done. So you have these two things going on. And that's why normally I wouldn't bring up in a lesson about the Omer that this controversy in our history. But I think it's important because it shows us to this day, there are people that begin the counting after the first Shabbat of Pesach. Now, the majority of, David's right, the majority of scribes and teachers in Judaism now say it begins on the second day of Passover, the day after the Shabbat of Passover. So that's the majority, but there's still plenty of people who have other ideas on when it begins based on the Torah. My point in bringing it up isn't to add confusion. My point is simply to say we have that struggle with folks, with ourselves, with our families, and with each other is an important part of the process. It's an important part for us to struggle with ourselves between those two tendencies. And some of us maybe perhaps are more disciplined and more intellectual than others and more striving to do it the way the rabbis tell us to do it. And others are like more, I am in this ecstatic experience, and the ecstatic experience is what I'm seeking, not what day should I do this and what blessing should I say on this day and not say on that day. And that's a struggle that some of us find within ourselves even. Some of us are so sold out to either one that it doesn't really apply. But that's a danger to me, I feel, not having that struggle. Because this whole experience of Pesach to counting the Omer to Shavuot is about unity. And it's about unity that we talked about in the series on the life of Jacob, right? So in the life of Jacob, we discovered that in the tree of life, he is the balance between chesed and geverah. Between those columns, he is the example of Tiferet, the central column, and the balance of those things. So this controversy itself, how we look at it, because I'm going to show you a graph that Ruthie made for me that shows the prescription of the days and how they relate to the Sephirot, right? So when we look at that, we'll see how it's been given to us by the Kabbalists and rabbis and teachers, and it's very, very helpful, and I like it. I'm not suggesting it's wrong. But we're already on the 10th day here in the United States, and this evening will be the 11th day. Does that mean we can't have that experience that the Kabbalists are telling us to have of unity that preceded this day if we hadn't started yet? Or what day is it and how important is that? I'm not arguing for either side. I'm just saying that that's part of the unification process. That's part of Jacob's journey, right? Because Jacob was both. He managed to have the experience of both like that. So the name of the holiday is described as Sefirat HaOmer. So Sefirat, it's the letters of the word Sefirot. It's counting, right? Now, why is Sefirat related to counting? Because as creation comes into being from Ein Sof, which is limitless unboundedness, right? If there's going to be something out of nothing, or the finite out of the infinite, it has to begin with counting. Because if there's only one, when there becomes two, that's counting. It's just that simple. Within the infinite is contained the finite by definition. But as it becomes through order. Seder hashtil shilot, right? And order involves counting. So now we're looking at these 49 days. So it's 7 weeks of 7 days. So when we're looking at David's teaching on, and Ruthie and myself on Adar, and then Jack going into Nisan, this is cycles. So cycles begin, the Galgalim begin to happen as formation, creation and formation begin to happen. And the example of the metaphor that we use, that the Kabbalists have been using for centuries, is certainly the tree of life, right? So when we look at this tree of life, the Sephirot are on the tree of life. So this counting begins with what we call the laws of the seven. And the laws of the seven, as Jack pointed out, we're relating in each one of these movements, in each one of these Galgalim, and in every holiday, there's an awareness of the symbiotic nature of life with nature itself, right? So now we have the first fruits. We have the rebirth of Nisan, and we have the first fruits. So the counting begins with the Omer itself, which is that sheath of barley that's waved by the priest. So there's a connection, a spiritual connection to the physical reality of the first fruits of life and the rebirth of Nisan itself. So this total connection that we have is very important for our mindfulness practice. We have this mindfulness practice, this hitbonen, as we call it, as Jack explained, brings us into this counting of the Omer, right? So if we show the chart, maybe on if we can get it up there. Okay, so to the left there on your screen is the tree of life with the Sephirot, right? So we're dealing with, in the laws of seven, the middle and lower Sephirot. Beyond that, Holy of Holies, and the beginning with the inner court and moving into the outer court. So Chesed is the first week. So that's important because it's a priority. It's, as the Psalms say, and the Proverbs and Shir HaShirim, we lean to the side of Chesed, to the right, and our Gevurah is united with Chesed by the power of Chesed. So the first week, as we go to the right graph, is a week of Chesed. So we look at that. What is that? If we're going to have mindfulness of it, it's a Hebrew word. If it doesn't mean anything to us, how can we be mindful that week of Chesed? Chesed, we know, is mercy and kindness, compassion, all of those beautiful things. So when we're studying, we might want to look into that. However I'm not here to say how we look, how we're mindful, or to present you with a prescription of mindfulness practice. You do that on your own. But the Torah is telling us the 7 times 7 is important. So when the ancients looked at the moon and the cycles of the moon, it was very important because the moon affected them spiritually. It was very clear in the sky. So we're talking about pre-telescope age, right? And we look at the mystics of old and the Sefer Yetzirah, and there are 7 luminaries. And the last one is represents the Tav and is the moon. The first one is Saturn and it's Bet, right? So we have these things that we look at in the Sefer Yetzirah, the seven. Seven didn't just come out of nowhere because the ancients realized in these phases of the moon. So the beautiful thing about the Jewish calendar is that it's not just a lunar calendar, it's a lunar calendar with an amalgam of the solar calendar. So both things are kind of brought together from the experience of the Kabbalists, and their actual experience brought this binah or this understanding. Look at the moon and how it affects them, the new moon, and then in 7 days, there was this sort of quarter moon or half moon, right? And then a full moon, and then a three-quarter moon. And then the fourth process of 7 days circled all the way back so you're going from the new moon to a quarter moon to a full moon to a three-quarter moon back to back to the new moon, Rosh Chodesh. So all of these experiences made it clear about the 7 days. And then 7 times 7. So it shows up not only in the Torah, not only in the Sefer Yetzirah, but also in nature, right? So there are 7 notes in the musical scale, but there are also, so those are 7 vibrations, very important vibrations. And we look at the luminaries that we can see, and we see 7. And then in the spectrum, the color spectrum of the rainbow, the 7 colors that are in the color spectrum of the rainbow. A lot of work has been done on this. There's a guy that I want to introduce you to if you don't know his name, George Gurdjieff. His name is spelled Gurdjieff. He was a 19th century Armenian Greek mystic. And he did a lot with this. He was an amazing guy. He was an explorer. He went to all the different places and sort of seats, beautiful seats of this mystical knowledge. So of course he went to the Middle East and he was studied there, and then he went to India and studied there as well. He studied in China. So he did all of this research, incredible amount of research. And he came up with what he called the laws of 7. But he wasn't afraid to say he gathered it from all of these mystical sources in the land we now call Israel and in all sorts of other places. In India, studied with the Shankaracharyas and so forth, right? So he brings about the idea of the octave. The octave simply means it's talking about 8 now, right? So I don't mean to confuse you. I hope I can make this as simple as possible. But when we have 7, the day after 7 times 7 is actually the day of Shavuot. So that extra day is always understood mystically. So we have all of these days where we're having mindfulness. If we go back to the chart, we're having mindfulness practice of each 7 of 7 weeks. So right now, just for example, to make this, if you look on that graph, we're in the 2nd week, which is the week of Gevorah, and the 10th day. The 10th day is a day of Tiferet, right? So on this day, we're mindful of Gevorah and Tiferet. Tiferet is Jacob and beauty, and the beauty of the harmony of the left and right sides. And Gevorah is what provides discipline and strength and in our striving. Right? We talked about 2 different kind of characters, someone who looks at things very strictly and someone who looks at things more broadly and open. Well, that's combining of those 2 things is Tiferet. And Gevorah is the basis of our discipline and our study and our practice. So when we look at each day of these weeks, we can look at them in that way. And then the 50th day, after we've completed the union of all of these 7 Sephirot in our lives in a mindful way, we experience them with Aleph, the one, the pure experience of consciousness, right? So this is the experience of ascendance and descendants, ascendance and descendants, ascendance in every mindful form. But what we're circling back to always is the oneness, the echad, the oneness that ultimately we experience on the 50th day. The 50th day of Shavuot is when we receive from the divine presence. And that unifies all that we've experienced during these 49 weeks. So in a sense, if you go back to the left side, right here, left side of your graph, not the left side of the tree of life, go back to the left side of your graph, you can see all of this is happening in these 49 days. And then when we get through Malkut, we circle back to the week of Malkut. We circle back after the 49th day to the unification of Binah, Hakmah, and Keter. That brings us into a sleep state while we're completely awake and we're able to receive. And that's the state of consciousness that is what Shavuot is. That's the mountaintop experience where we receive the Torah and how it was received. So going back to Gurdjieff, I wanted to read something that he wrote that I think relates to what I'm saying. All matter in the universe consists of vibrations descending towards their origin or manifestation, ascending in volition or ascending in a return to the formless source. The development is not continuous, but characterized by periodic accelerations and retardations at definite intervals. So this is when we talk about the dialectic, right? And construction, deconstruction, and synthesis. It's what we see all around us in nature. There should be no surprise. And this is how Gurdjieff experiences it, right? We see it today. Now things are blooming, and then they'll die, and then they'll rebloom, and then they'll die and rebloom. This is dialectic. But he's saying there are vibrations, and that's what we talk about, the vibrations of sound and light in our practice and connecting with them. So in our Hippoded practice, we use those sounds and vibrations to descend within to where all things are formed, Ein Sof, where everything comes from. And then they ascend in the same way. All right? The laws governing this process are embodied in an ancient formula that divides the period in which a vibration doubles into 8 equal steps corresponding to the rate of increase in the vibrations. So when vibrations increase in rate, the tone goes up. When vibrations decrease in rate, the tone is lower. Higher and lower vibrations, like that, like that. This period is called an octave, that is to say, composed of 8. The formula lies in the basis of the biblical myth of the creation of the world and our division of time into work days and Shabbats. Applied to music, the formula is expressed in a musical scale, and he says do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, with semitones in the intervals, mi, fa, and si, do. The inner movement towards consciousness requires a conscious look or shock at these intervals in order to proceed to a higher level or a new octave. So there are all these octaves in music. Octaves goes from one sound to another. Technically, there's 7 tones. Because if you go from C to C, C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, there's two C's, right? But those are an octave. That's what makes eight. So we have all these sevens that bring us to eight, which is the completion of the circle of the octave, right? So that's what we experience. What he's saying here, to continue that, and he's saying in his teachings, if you read any of his books, it's saying that these things don't go in a straight line. That's when he talks about those shocks or or moving them, right? Understanding these sound vibrations and the ups and downs, ascending and descending, is this mindfulness practice. So we have the mindfulness practice that's in the graph there. Today, we could be studying what is Sefirat in relation to Gevurah. But the last thing I want to do is make another prescription. There's so many prescriptions in all the traditions, it's enough already. But what I am saying is the struggle between should I do this today or should I do this tomorrow is your personal struggle. The blessing you say is your personal blessing. But the beauty of this time between Pesach and Shavuot, it's a wheel that brings us to a unity where the end is embedded in the beginning and the beginning is embedded in the end. Even this week's Torah portion, Shemoni, Shemoni means eight. And it's a Torah portion of Moses and Aaron after all of this instruction about how the priest should handle the sacrifices, right? And all the work and the preparation of the building of the tabernacle and everything comes this point, the 7 times 7 point, where Aaron performs these things. And then on the eighth day, God blesses all of Israel through it. And the sacrifice is consumed by God. So the point being, during this time that connects us with Shavuot, Pesach and Shavuot, is a time to go through the ascendance of these 7 lower Sephirot and reconnect them with the higher Sephirot and the one Yechad of pure consciousness. And how do we do this? We do it first, of course, each and every day with our mindlessness practice, experiencing that silent, unbounded state of consciousness. But then in our day, in our mindfulness, whatever activity we can do that will give us some Binah experience of these 7 Sephirot, right? And we talked about Jacob being Tiferet, and we talked about the place of Revka and Abraham and Sarah and all of these things in the Sephirot. Those are helpful to me when I look at those characters, right? And I look at Revka and I think of a certain day and how she came from Gevurah and became an embodiment of Chesed. That helps me to have a flavor of that in my mindfulness practice. Or when we read the Psalms and we see David, who is the embodiment of Malkut, and we see David experiencing this incredible love for God, for the divine in him and all around him. To me, David is the most misrepresented of all of the biblical figures, misunderstood, extremely humble, and his sole desire is to complete God's will in his life. And it drives me crazy when people compare him to modern day political figures who are mostly narcissistic. Drives me crazy. But maybe we'll do a study on the life of David at some point. But looking at those things in our mindfulness practice during these 49 days brings us to a state where we're in that surrender in a wholeness way, as Jacob was in Tiferet. And we allow ourselves to experience Shavuot. Because Shavuot is a time of receiving. We're receiving the Torah, right? And that creates the opportunity for Ha'adam. Ha'adam. So when Adam is mentioned in the Torah as just Adam, it's just Adam. But when it says Ha'adam, the man, Jim pointed out when we were doing the Pesach lesson in the question and answer period, when we're talking about the fall and freedom and all that, that he had learned that the fall had began with the separation of Ha'adam into Ish and Isha. So man and woman separating from their completeness. Ha'adam is like Jacob. Ha'adam is that state of consciousness where these things on that graph, on the tree of life, we experience them in complete union on the 50th day with the Aleph. Many Kabbalists run around using Aleph with all the other letters, right? Including in our tradition. It's so tedious. You can spend 3 hours and not complete it. I was taught that's a mistake because the Aleph is the pure consciousness. Yeah, we do our meditation on Aleph, but each time we meditate on any letter, it combines with the Aleph because that's the pure silence that we experience. We don't need to say Aleph. Aleph doesn't even have a sound. Aleph is that pure, unbounded, pure consciousness that is silent. It's Ha'adam. So the gematria for Ha'adam, guess what it is? I bet you David knows, but he doesn't get the answer. It's 50. 50 is the gematria for Ha'adam. And the 50th day is Shavuot. So that brings us in the full circle.